Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world that actually existed, not a fantasy, not a utopia invented by philosophers or dreamers. A real world that real people lived in, breathed in, built families inside of. It is a Friday evening in the autumn of 1889. A carpenter in Cincinnati has just finished his week. 6 days of work. His hands are calloused and darkened with sawdust. He collects his pay from his employer, coins and folded paper pressed into his palm, and he walks home through streets lit by gas lamps. That money, every cent of it, is his. Not partially his, not his pending review, not subject to a figure he has never met deciding what portion he has earned the right to keep. The full amount, the exact sum agreed between him and his employer, belongs to him entirely the moment it touches his hand. No form to file, no number assigned to him by a distant government, no deadline in April when a portion of what he built with his body and his time must be surrendered. He buys bread. He pays his rent. He sets something aside in a tin beneath the floorboards, saving toward the tools he needs to start his own small shop. He is not wealthy. His life is hard in ways ours is not. But in this one specific and foundational thing, he inhabits a reality so different from yours and mine that it is almost impossible to fully absorb. He owns his labor completely. Now, open your eyes. Because that world did not fade slowly, did not erode gradually across generations, did not drift away like a tide going out so gently you never noticed the waterline changing. That world ended in a single year, with a single legal instrument, and then within a generation, the people living inside the new system could no longer remember what the old one had felt like. They had been conditioned so thoroughly that the loss was invisible to them, not because it was hidden, because the architecture of the new system was designed, deliberately and with great sophistication, to make the meridian taking feel like the natural order of things. That is what this investigation is actually about. Not just what was taken, but how they made you forget it was ever yours to begin with. Let's start with the foundation, the thing that most people either don't know or have never paused to actually sit with. For most of American history, from the founding of the Republic through the early years of the 20th century, the federal government did not tax the income of individual citizens. This is not a fringe claim. It is not a disputed historical footnote. It is a simple fact, available in any serious constitutional history, that has been allowed to fade into the background of a national memory that finds it too uncomfortable to foreground. The government funded itself through tariffs, import duties on goods brought into the country, and excise taxes on specific products like alcohol and tobacco. These were taxes on transactions and choices. A tariff touched you when you decided to purchase something made abroad. An excise tax touched you when you chose to buy a taxed good. You could, if you lived simply and locally and carefully, move through an entire year of productive life and pay almost nothing to the federal government directly. More importantly, and this is the distinction that matters more than anything else we will discuss today, no one could reach into the transaction between you and your employer, between you and your land, between you and the skill of your hands, and say, before this is yours, we take a portion. That reaching, that prior claim, did not exist. There was a brief exception. During the Civil War, the federal government introduced an income tax as an emergency wartime measure. Brief is the key word. It was repealed in 1872. And then in 1895, when Congress tried again, the Supreme Court struck it down in a ruling that was direct and clear. A direct tax on income, unapportioned among the states, violated the Constitution. The legal architecture of the Republic, as interpreted by its highest court, treated the individual's productive output as something the federal government simply could not directly claim. That ruling stood for 18 years, and then, in 1913, it didn't. The 16th Amendment was ratified in February of that year. By October, Americans filed their first federal income tax returns. The top marginal rate was 7%, applied only to incomes above the equivalent of what today would be millions of dollars. The average working person, that carpenter in Cincinnati, that seamstress in Philadelphia, that farmer in Iowa, paid nothing at all. The tax was presented as a modest, targeted measure aimed at the very wealthy. A small, reasonable thing. Almost symbolic. Almost. Because here is the part that the official version of this history tends to skip over rather quickly. The importance of 1913 was never the rate. The rate was theater. The importance of 1913 was the precedent, the constitutional permission, the architecture of a mechanism that, once built, could be expanded at will by whoever controlled the levers of government at any given moment. And they expanded it. They always expanded. By 1918, just 5 years later, the top marginal rate was 77%. By 1944, it had reached 94%. That is not a slow drift. That is not a gradual evolution of policy responding to changing social needs. That is an infrastructure being used to its full capacity once the inhibitions against using it have been dissolved by time and familiarity. But the rate is still not the most interesting part of this story. The most interesting part, the part that no one seems to want to look at directly, is not what was taken. It is how they made you stop noticing. Let's talk about a man named Beardsley Rumel. You almost certainly have never heard of him. Most people haven't. He was the treasurer of E.R.H. Macy and Company, the department store, and during the Second World War, he proposed an idea to the United States Treasury that would, without exaggeration, permanently alter the psychology of every working person in America. His idea was withholding. Before 1943, Americans who owed income tax paid it themselves annually in a lump sum. You received your wages in full. You saved a portion throughout the year or set it aside at filing time, and then you paid what was owed. The money passed through your hands. You held it. It felt like yours, because it was yours, until the moment you chose to pay it over. Rummel understood something that we would today call behavioral economics. He understood that the psychological experience of paying an annual lump sum to the government was very different from the psychological experience of never seeing the money in the first place. He understood that a person who hands over $400 in April feels that loss. They feel it with a sharpness and a clarity that makes them think about what they are surrendering, and to whom, and for what. But a person who simply receives their net pay, who has never held the gross, who has never experienced the physical reality of the full sum, does not feel the same loss, because it does not register as a loss at all. It registers as the natural state of things. Rummel proposed withholding during wartime specifically, framing it as a patriotic measure to ensure steady revenue for the war effort. Questioning it during wartime carried an implicit social cost. To object was to be the kind of person who haggled over receipts while soldiers were dying on Pacific islands. The political environment made the change almost frictionless, and with that single administrative shift, the entire emotional and psychological relationship between American workers and their income was transformed. The gross became a number on a form. The net became the paycheck. Within a single generation, the notion that you were receiving a reduced version of what you had actually earned felt not like a violation of something fundamental, but simply like the way wages work, the way they have always worked, the way they obviously must work. That normalization did not happen by accident. It was designed. And here is where the investigation deepens in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Because the behavioral sophistication visible in the withholding mechanism is not an isolated feature of American tax policy, it is a pattern that repeats across countries, across cultures, across borders that were otherwise hostile to any form of coordination. Britain introduced a formal income tax in 1799, framed as a temporary emergency measure for the Napoleonic Wars. It was abolished after the war, reintroduced in 1842, and made permanent. Germany built its income tax infrastructure through the 1870s and 1880s. France debated and implemented it in the early 20th century. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all within a similar historical window. Different governments, different legal traditions, different languages and cultures and geopolitical relationships. And yet the same basic architecture, individual income reported, calculated, surrendered, enforced criminally, appeared across all of them within the same century, following the same sequence with unsettling regularity. First the tax, then the bureaucracy, then the criminal penalty structure, then the normalization so complete that the generation raised inside it could not imagine the world that had existed before. You could explain this as the natural product of industrialization. Wage labor at scale created an income stream that simply didn't exist when most people farmed or traded locally. That is a reasonable argument, but it does not explain the timing. It does not explain why the mechanisms arrived in such similar forms with such similar enforcement structures in countries that were competing with each other militarily, economically, diplomatically. It does not explain why the criminalization follows such a consistent pattern across borders that had no formal mechanism for coordinating domestic tax policy. At some point, the uniformity stops, looking like parallel evolution, and starts looking like instruction. Now let's return to the place where this story is most visible, the place where the old world and the new world can still be seen standing side by side, if you know how to look. There is a set of documents available through the National Archives, letters and records and congressional transcripts from the years surrounding 1913 that almost no one outside of academic legal history ever reads. And in those documents you can find, if you are patient and if you are willing to sit with what you find, evidence of people who understood exactly what was being built. One congressman, his name now largely forgotten, entered into the official congressional record in 1911, 2 years before the amendment passed, a statement that deserves to be read very slowly. He wrote that the American citizen has never in the history of this republic been compelled to surrender a portion of his labor directly to the federal government. He was making a legal argument against the amendment. He understood that what was being proposed was not a tax policy. It was a constitutional transformation of the relationship between citizens and their government. He lost the argument. His words were entered into the record and filed away. Decades passed. The digitization of archives brought them back into the light. He saw the architecture for what it was. The question that remains, the question that I find genuinely difficult to resolve, is whether the people building it saw it the same way. Because look at what else happened in that same year. 1913, the same calendar year that produced the 16th Amendment and the first federal income tax also produced the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law in December. 2 transformative pieces of financial legislation in the same 12 months. One giving the government a permanent, expandable claim on individual income. The other creating a centralized banking system capable of managing government debt. Think carefully about what those 2 things accomplish together. A government that can tax income has a predictable, recurring, scalable revenue stream. A central bank allows that government to borrow against future tax revenue, to expand its obligations and its ambitions far beyond what current revenue alone could support. One mechanism feeds the other. Together, they form something that neither could be alone. This is not coincidence. This is not bureaucratic accident. This is infrastructure. The question is, infrastructure for what? For something that did not exist before 1913. For something that required both of these mechanisms simultaneously in order to function. And then there is the enforcement apparatus. This is the detail that I keep returning to because I cannot find a satisfying conventional explanation for it. In 1912, there is no federal income tax enforcement infrastructure in the United States. There cannot be, because there is no federal income tax, no auditors, no investigators with federal criminal authority, no agency empowered to seize wages or accounts or property, zero infrastructure because zero need. By 1919, 6 years after the amendment, the Bureau of Internal Revenue employs thousands of people. It has regional offices in major cities across the country. It has an intelligence division. It has special agents with prosecutorial referral authority. It has purpose-built or commandeered physical buildings operating in coordinated networks from the East Coast to the West. 6 years. Institutional architecture does not materialize fully formed in 6 years. It gets designed. It gets planned. Org charts get drawn. Training manuals get written. Budgets get allocated. Staffing pipelines get established. Physical space gets identified and secured. None of that happens in response to a law that was just passed. All of that happens in anticipation of a law that someone already knows is coming. The enforcement machine was not built to serve the tax. The tax was the justification for building the machine. And once you understand that sequence, once you absorb the fact that the apparatus preceded the need rather than responding to it, the entire official narrative of the income tax as a simple progressive policy measure designed by reformers who wanted the wealthy to pay their share starts to feel like exactly what it was. A story told to the public. A convenient and emotionally appealing frame designed to make the mechanism feel like justice rather than transformation. Now, let's go back to that carpenter, and let's think about what his grandchildren were told. His grandchildren were born after 1913. By the time they entered the workforce, withholding had already been introduced. The gross wage was already an abstraction for them. The tax return was already an annual ritual as ordinary tea, and unremarkable as hanging Christmas lights or raking autumn leaves. The April deadline was already woven into the fabric of domestic life so thoroughly that it felt like a feature of the natural world, rather than a legal obligation that had not existed a single generation before. And when they tried to teach their own children about money, about earning and saving and building a life, the framework they used was already the new one. The one where your paycheck is your paycheck and the portion taken before you see it is simply how wages work. The world their grandfather had inhabited, the world where keeping everything you earned was not a radical proposition, but simply Tuesday, had become not just forgotten, but literally unimaginable. This is how you redesign a civilization without a revolution, not through force, not through conquest, through the far more durable method of making the new assumptions feel so natural that the old ones become incomprehensible, through raising children inside a system until the system is all they have ever known, and therefore all they can imagine knowing. Through the quiet administrative decision to deduct before delivery so that the full sum never passes through the hands it belongs to, and the taking never registers as taking. The behavioral architects of this system understood something profound about human psychology. They understood that what feels normal is determined not by what is just or what is logical or even what is legal, but by what is familiar, by what has always been this way for as far back as personal memory extends. They understood that a mechanism introduced during wartime, when questioning it was socially dangerous, would be inherited by peacetime without the questions ever being reactivated. They understood all of this, and they built accordingly. There is one more detail that I want to leave you with, because I think it is the most quietly devastating fact in this entire investigation. Before 1913, there was no such thing as a federal tax criminal at the personal income level. Not because people were unusually honest or unusually compliant, but because the category did not exist. You could not be prosecuted for something that was not required of you. The crime of failing to file, the crime of tax evasion at the federal personal level, was not a crime that existed in American law. It literally could not exist because the obligation it would attach to had not been created. After 1913, a new class of criminal was invented. Not someone who had harmed another person, not someone who had stolen from a specific victim or defrauded a specific party, but someone who had simply failed to accurately report and surrender a portion of their own labor to a centralized authority. Someone who had lived, in other words, exactly as their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had lived without any legal problem at all. Criminality defines civilization. What a society chooses to prosecute tells you what that society is actually protecting. And in 1913, America, a thing that had been legal and normal for the entire history of the Republic, was redesigned by constitutional amendment into an obligation backed by criminal penalty. They made it a crime to live as your ancestors had lived, not all at once. The criminal penalties crept in quietly, appended to revenue acts across the 1910s and 1920s, expanded during wartime when questioning such things carried its own social cost, normalized across decades until they felt as ancient and inevitable as the laws against theft or violence. But they were not ancient. They were not inevitable. They were designed, sequenced, introduced at their most modest and least threatening scale, then expanded to fill the available space once the inhibitions against expansion had dissolved. The initial rate was never the point. The mechanism was always the point. And here is the question that I find myself unable to stop asking, the one that brought me back to these archives again and again across the months I spent with these documents. The one I want to leave sitting with you, not because I have a clean answer, but because I think it is the most important question you can ask when looking at this history. If the people who built this architecture understood behavioral economics well enough to design withholding, if they understood institutional momentum well enough to build the enforcement apparatus before the law required it, if they understood constitutional strategy well enough to introduce a rate so low it felt harmless while creating a mechanism that could be expanded without limit, if they understood the psychology of wartime framing well enough to use it twice, once to introduce the amendment and once to normalize withholding. If they understood all of that, what exactly did they think they were building? Because whatever it was, we are still living inside it. Most of us never stopped to notice the walls. Most of us have never once asked what was here before them. Most of us do not know the name of that congressman whose words were entered into the record in 1911, who saw the architecture clearly, who argued against it, who lost, and whose warning sat in a basement archive for a century waiting. For someone to come looking, he saw it. The question is whether we are willing to.